Hi, everyone. This is a presentation on some of the material that we were not able to cover in class so far. This is pulling a few notes together from an author named Wolfgang Schievelbusch and also Erich Goode Chapter Two. So we're going to look at social construction of drugs and a history of drug enforcement. This is going to help you as we get into the material from this week, week 4, looking at drug wars or attempts to eliminate drugs from society. So when we use the phrase social construction, what do we actually mean? You've probably heard that phrase. We talk about the social construction of gender, the social construction of race, the social construction of sexuality. What do these terms mean? How can we understand them? So let's look at the social construction as a sort of general concept. So anything that happens within a society, especially when we're looking at big concepts like race or gender or ethnicity or drug use, we need to kind of think about how the way our society comes to understand them is not just the facts, but also the meaning that they attach to those facts, what facts they decide they think are relevant, and then also how they begin to remember any particular social interaction or a social concept. So social construction is about meaning making. It's about questions of expertise and legitimacy. Who do we consider as a legitimate authority on, say, drug use or on race or on gender? Who are the experts and who are we listening to in any particular generation? And we actually notice those change quite a bit over time. Also, questions about freedom and harm, especially in the United States, where this idea of individual freedom is another really big social construction. It seems to be valued very highly. We kind of have this balance in this society between the notion of freedom, that might be, say, the right to control what you do with your body, including what drugs you may or may not put in your body, and then the question of what we think is harm. And should, say, government or any other authorities be able to control certain substances because we think that the harm outweighs the question of individual freedom. And of course, underlying all of this is media, whether it's news media, popular media. Media often constructs the narrative around how we understand, again, how we understand gender, how we understand race, how we understand drug use or drug addiction or drug selling, and how those meanings change over time. So as always, we interpret everything through sociological paradigms. So these are the two we're going to use right now. We've already spoken about structural functionalism. This is one way of viewing drug use and constructing meaning around it. So structural functionalism would argue that if we have laws or mores or moral condemnation about drug use, that's reflecting a mainstream social consensus. It happens because we're fulfilling a social need, let's say for order, because drugs are seen as causing disorder or harm or pain to social institutions, to social groups. But the conflict perspective looks at this in many ways from the opposite angle. They see attempts to control drugs, maybe not always, but very often as a reflection of power. It's the power of some groups to impose either their moral ideas or their social values upon other groups. And sometimes these laws are just flat out ways of controlling, from the conflict perspective, social classes or racial groups or ethnic groups. So we can say in a lot of ways social construction is just stories that we tell about something, and then we keep repeating those. They become institutionalized in our society. We tell stories about, say, what a drug is. There's nothing settled about the term drug, and we already know it's got so many different meanings. A drug is a totally legitimate thing in one sense. We go to the drugstore to buy a drug that we think is going to heal us, or we get prescribed that drug by some medical professional who we trust has our health in mind. But drug also means something that we think is harmful. And along with that comes terms like an addict or a dealer. But these terms, again, an addict, what is an addict? Is it somebody who uses a drug every day? Do they use it all day long? Do they use it only sometimes? Do they just binge on it every so often? These are not settled terms. And we, of course, associate certain stereotypes and images with what an addict means. Likewise, who is a dealer? When CVS sells OxyContin, does that make them a drug dealer? Or do we think a drug dealer is only, say, someone on a street corner in a certain neighborhood, or somebody who delivers drugs sort of to people that they know as their customers? These meanings are often caught up around questions of sin and righteousness, right? So certain, especially in a heavily Protestant society, as this society at least historically was, there are lots of questions about sin and, say, pleasure, right? Protestant societies had a lot of discomfort around something that might induce pleasure or euphoria sensation, right? We can think about even something like coffee in the Mormon religion. Coffee or hot beverages, right, are completely considered something that you should not drink because it stimulates the body in suspicious ways, right? It might be maybe something akin to sin, right? So on the other side of that is the question of righteousness, right? Many times or many eras, especially we can think about the era leading up to alcohol prohibition. There were ideas about godliness or about moral behavior that considered the consumption of alcohol either sinful or unrighteous. Sometimes, and in fact often, especially when it comes to something like the social construction of drugs, fear is involved. Not just fear of the drugs themselves, but who uses these substances. Stories begin to spread about any given substance, maybe giving people superhuman powers to cause incredible destruction and danger. In almost every era, we heard that, whether it was marijuana in the 1930s, whether it was cocaine and crack in the 1980s, later on, methamphetamine, this idea that this drug was going to turn human beings into super destructive hyper criminals. So sometimes what happens is a moral panic sets in. This is when a society becomes extremely convinced that something incredibly harmful is going on. Oftentimes that there is actually a harm happening, but they may, the level of panic far sort of outreaches the actual level of harm, or sometimes the actual harm is not even happening, but the stories about the harm are occurring. Often this occurs in the context of othering, right? Some other group is associated with a drug or a substance. This is a group that maybe parts of the mainstream of a society think need to be kept out or removed or marginalized in some way. But status is also a really important part of this story, too. At certain points, certain substances were associated with high status or with low status. Sometimes people conspicuously displayed the consumption of certain substances as a way to say, well, I'm rich enough to afford this, or the way that I use this substance is better than the way that other people use it, because I can afford to use it in a way that is particularly glamorous or sophisticated. We'll talk about that shortly. So I had mentioned this before, the tastes of paradise in class. We really ran out of time when we started discussing it. So let's just spend a few more minutes on it. This is a book that I used to use in classes before, but we change books every so often because new material comes along. This is a very interesting, and it's a quick read if you ever want to sort of just grab it from the shelf at some point. Wolfgang Schivelbusch is a social historian. His title is Tastes of Paradise, and the subtitle, this is really important, The Social History of Spices, Stimulants, and Intoxicants. So what he's trying to do is put all of these together. He says we can't just look at the intoxicants, the things that we now would call drugs, in isolation of the social quest to get all of these other substances like the spices and the stimulants. So Wolfgang Schivelbusch argues that what we need to really kind of think about is how the modern era and the colonial period, the European colonization of much of the rest of the world, was in part a quest for what were considered certain tastes of paradise, things that were new discoveries for the Europeans, and things that ultimately they demanded in very, very large amounts. And so we can look at things like, say, spices, sugar, chocolate, coffee, tea, tobacco and snuff, alcohol, marijuana, opium, and then later on the synthesized opioids. Every item on here was only available far from Europe, mostly in the tropics or the subtropics, except for alcohol. Europeans did have beer and wine, but certain distilled spirits, rum in particular, become a major part of the colonial quest. And in order to get these items, they were willing to use military might, guns, ships, warships, explosives, and of course, ultimately to take and acquire and enslave the people in territories that they were beginning to colonize. So if we just look at spices first, for instance, we're talking about items like cardamom, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, turmeric, coriander. No one would think of any of these items except for nutmeg as a drug, but that isn't necessarily the point. He argues that what's going on here is there's almost this this mystique starting to build around these spices, and this quest to get as many of them as absolutely possible. The map on the right is just one map, or one empire. This is the Dutch Empire here, and what they had built in Indonesia was a very large slave colony starting in the 16th century. And as a result of that, though, they begin, here's Ceylon, where they're finding tea, Indonesia, where they're finding cloves and cinnamon and nutmeg, and of course, coffee. And just this quest to get from the Netherlands over to it's a very, very large colony that it's creating in Indonesia. They also settle here. They begin to use the Cape of Good Hope as a place, just a kind of watering place, a place for the ships to stop. But little by little over the century, this also starts to lead to the colonization of all of southern Africa as well. Cocoa is a big part of this story as well. Cocoa, obviously, not we think of cocoa as Belgian or Swiss or etc., but the cocoa itself does not come from any part of Europe. And cocoa becomes a part of the transatlantic slave trade. Eventually, this leads to more colonization in West Africa. Most cocoa now comes from West Africa. And of course, we don't think of cocoa as a drug. It's got a slight stimulant property to it, but it is part of this big picture of acquisition and colonization of these substances. With substances, whether it's drugs or any of the substances we're talking about, it's never just the drug or the substance itself. It's also big social developments that start to go along with it. So in the 18th century, we started seeing the spread of chocolate houses in many parts of Europe. And this is not the chocolate that you might be thinking of as in chocolate bars that are sweet and sugary. This is a very bitter drink made of cocoa beans, but it is associated with the aristocracy. It's seen as a kind of decadent way of getting together and kind of ostentatiously consuming these beverages and showing off one's wealth and lavishness. You can't see it, but in the corner there is this fancy urn. The fancier the urn that you could pour your chocolate beverage with, the more that you could sort of show off your wealth. But of much bigger consequence are the coffee houses that happen. Coffee, of course, are a really big part of colonial expansion. Just like sugar is associated with slavery in the Caribbean, coffee plantations in parts of Africa and parts of Latin America, also associated with both slavery and eventually in Europe with capitalism, right? So the coffee houses, even though the people in this photo look pretty aristocratic themselves, something is starting to change, right? The new bourgeois capitalist class is starting to emerge. Coffee is seen as the perfect capitalist beverage. Because it's stimulating, it's seen as something that keeps you awake and able to move more quickly as the capitalist societies are starting to move more quickly. Coffee houses turned into stock exchanges in some cases here between 1680 and 1778. This was a meeting place of the city's stockbrokers. At first, the stockbrokers start meeting in the coffee houses, and then the two institutions become separate. But coffee houses were seen as a really important engine of people coming together and exchanging new Enlightenment ideas, and also capitalist values, and a place to kind of seek connections and wealth. Tobacco, another product found not in Europe, but in much warmer climates. And tobacco was not just something to consume for the pure sake of tobacco, but also for showing off your symbolic wealth and taste. On the left there is an 18th century English smoking room where you would take your guests into the smoking room and proudly show off your opulence, your taste. On the right there is a cigar box, again, always showing that it's not just the cigar itself, but it's showing off who you are, what your status is in your society. Snuff, also derived from a concentrated form of tobacco and inhaled through the nose. Snuff rings then became very, very popular. People would take them around, walk down the street. You wanted people to see that you had a snuff ring, and you wanted them to see, or a snuff box, right, that it was particularly either delicate or opulent or tasteful. There were questions. I put this image here with this woman using snuff in a gilded framed photograph because there were questions about whether or not tobacco was supposed to be consumed by only men or women and men. Little by little, women, they weren't supposed to be seen smoking tobacco, but it was okay in the earlier days for them to use inhalant tobacco, snuff, which is actually oddly stronger than smoking tobacco. But you can then see that the use of substances at any given time is also a gendered thing as well. Of course, the things we just talked about, well, maybe people might consider the caffeine in coffee a drug. People might think of sugar as a drug, but there's no doubt that opium and cocaine are drugs. And so let's look a little bit at that history. We need to talk about the Opium Wars first, and then we'll talk about coca synthesized in 1859. So the Opium Wars this tells us a kind of how much drugs play a role in colonization and the creation of, quote, unquote, the modern world. So China, realizing that opium has addictive properties, is causing social disorder within China, bans opium, bans the sale and the consumption of opium. But the British have two objectives in trying to force opium into China. One, it's tremendously popular. The opium is grown in India, and the British East India Company wants to expand their markets all along the Chinese shore and along the border. So the British start illegally smuggling the drug from India into China. And there's also, because the British had already colonized India, now they're after at least colonizing parts of China. And the idea is that if you can get the population dependent on opium, it will be easier to take over those territories. So the Chinese fight back by destroying a big shipment in the Canton province, and this sets off the first war. The war lasts for 3 years. When the Chinese are defeated, they are forced to pay billions of dollars in compensation to the British for things like destroyed ships and the use of armaments, etc. And for several years, several decades, the British now have a kind of open market for pushing opium into China. The Second Opium War happens in 1856. This is an attempt to force the trade open in an official legal way. One of the things that the British do is they sack and they burn the emperor's palace, and ultimately this does force open and legalize the trade. Now the irony that happens is that the British force open the opium trade, get much of the Chinese population dependent on opium, and then in the United States around this time, this big fear, this xenophobia is going to develop in the next few years, associating Chinese people with the use of opium. But of course, it's forgotten that it's the British that initiate this whole connection. So along with the use of drug use, we have to then now start looking at the history of drug control. In the 19th century, so remember the Opium Wars also happened in this century, Erich Goode calls this century a dope fiend's paradise. It's an odd phrase. It's a stereotypical phrase, but he uses this deliberately to kind of shake up the reader. And what he means by this, of course, is that there are absolutely no laws and restrictions in the United States at this time on the marketing of opium or stimulants, and therefore people can get pretty much what they want as long as they can afford it. So if we look at the significance of opium, it's first used about 6,000 years ago by the Sumerians. It's been around for a long time. It really became in a significant story in the United States. You know, people were smoking opium in the States in the 18th century, but it's really the 19th century when morphine is synthesized that the story changes very significantly. As we mentioned before, morphine was and is a major medical story. It's a big advance in medicine. It's a medical modern miracle. Before morphine, surgeries were so unbearably painful that people often died in the surgery from the pain, not from the actual condition that the surgery was undertaken for. And recovery from injuries was also incredibly painful. Alcohol was the only treatment that people had. It was not very effective. So opium then allows the advance of medicine to actually start, kind of operating on the body in a way that was previously unimaginable. Now people could endure what was happening. Morphine, of course, also becomes important during mass casualty events like wars and, of course, soon the Civil War in the 1860s. So let's look a little bit at the timeline. In 1814, we get morphine. A milder form of synthesized opium comes along in 1831 with codeine. The syringe is developed in 1856 so that people could begin to directly inject these substances in their bodies. There's no control over these developments. There's no limiting who can use these developments, although locally there are attempts to start confining morphine and codeine to medical practices. So in 1859, cocaine is synthesized from coca. It is about 100 times stronger than a coca leaf, and it is also hailed as a miracle of modern science for a little while. And in 1874, along comes heroin. In 1898, the name heroin is chosen by the Bayer company because it's marketed by Bayer, as in Bayer aspirin. The name heroin is chosen because it's sort of trying to associate the drug with heroics or heroism. In the 19th century, again, this wide and free availability meant that people were marketing opioids all over the place. So traveling salesmen took it door to door. Doctors gave it out. Drugstores sold it. Grocery stores sold it. And people used it for, they thought you could treat anything with it, including things like flat feet, baldness, toothaches, a cold, cancer, diarrhea. People used it for to treat things like menstruation. And we see, I've shown you this already before, but Mrs. Winslow's was a drop, a soothing syrup that was seen as something to kind of calm down children. It was marketed for more than 70 years, and it had opium in it. In the Sears Roebuck's calendar, you could, starting in 1897, buy a hypodermic needle kit with both the heroin and the needle for $1.50. And cocaine toothache drops were given to children because it was this kind of sense that, well, that would numb the pain in the jaw. We talked about the cocaine drinks, Vin Mariani wine, seen as a kind of something that people of the high classes should drink. We mentioned before that the Pope gave an award for the quality of this wine, and he thought it was a treatment for everything from getting over an illness or treating the flu, kind of strengthening oneself, strengthening the brain, etc. And Coca-Cola, of course, comes along. There is this misperception. In fact, Carl Hart, note this. You should note this when you're reading Carl Hart, that he mentions that Coca-Cola had cocaine in it. He is wrong about that. So remember, when you're reading something and they repeat something that is factually incorrect, it should make you say, okay, well, does he have everything else right also? But Coca-Cola had coca in it. And of course, it's funny the way they market it. It was funny to our eyes today, right? So it's good for men because it's good for business and professionalism, and of course, it's also good for the ladies because it can sort of relieve their physical exhaustion or their thirst or their despondency, and now, if we think about the 19th century, in the case of opium, three groups of people emerge as users of opium. So the first are the medical addicts. These are the people who had doctors give them opium for some sort of treatment. And oftentimes, women. Now, we've got to think about what women were experiencing in the 19th century. Wealthy women, white women, were expected largely to stay home, have no public life apart from their husband, and no professional life. So they were often confined in these home spaces. If they didn't like it, if they did not enjoy it, if they felt anxious about being cooped up at home, they were often labeled hysterics by their doctors. Women were diagnosed with all these quote-unquote nervous disorders and hysteria, and the doctors then gave them morphine. So this creates a form of medical addiction, and it was a kind of easily treatable thing in the sense that they became maintainers. As long as you had a steady supply of morphine and you could sort of fend off addiction, it wasn't causing terrible problems. Sometimes people were taking it too much and becoming very, kind of lethargic, etc. But the big worry was actually withdrawal from not getting access. So opium smokers were another group of people. They were using it. These were mostly men meeting in opium dens, using it for recreational purposes. And then increasingly, it becomes associated with the criminal underworld of the 19th century. We only start to see the call for laws to limit access to certain drugs around the turn of the century. So as the 20th century is starting to open, but we need to carefully understand what these laws are coming from. So a lot of cultural ferment is happening, right? So in the late 19th century, the US is going through this rapid industrialization. Cities are growing very, very quickly, people leaving the countryside and going into urban spaces. There's also a very, very high, the highest immigration ever in our history is appearing at that point. And so there's a lot of question and concern. Well, who is coming into the country? So there's a kind of fear and an othering starts to grow. We already noted that alcohol prohibition partly occurs because alcohol is associated with certain immigrant groups, and this disturbing fallen religion called Catholicism, because this is a very, very heavily Protestant country at the time. Racism becomes a really big part of this story. We'll talk about that shortly. And also the field of social work is getting established. So social work, this idea that you could work with clients, manage their behavior and their adjustment to the modern industrial order, is starting to get professionalized, and this becomes also a big part of the story. So opium, people didn't really quite understand that there might be harmful effects to opium until little by little people start writing about it. You recognize these names, I'm sure, from your English literature courses: Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Thomas de Quincey. They both write about their own experiences, about how painful being addicted to opium became for them. They didn't know that it was going to become addicting to them. Thomas de Quincey talks about being ensnared into this lifetime of despair, misery and despair, because he cannot stop using opium. Edgar Allan Poe, another name I'm sure you recognize, described himself as having become a bounden slave in the trammels of opium. So people are becoming aware that opium is not just something that soothes your pain or maybe takes away your misery for a while, but also there's this incredible downside, at least for some people. So the first drug laws that actually come are not really about limiting addiction to opium so much as it is about the fear of Chinese immigrants. So in the West Coast, Chinese immigrants had been imported in very large numbers. Especially there's everything from the California Gold Rush to the building of the transcontinental railways. And that was all fine and good for people who were not Chinese, as long as there was an economic boom going on. But every time there was an economic bust, which is inevitable, they would turn against the Chinese workers. And they would, so for instance, you can even see here, this is a labor union's marketing of stereotypes, right? The Chinese must go. And this is the working men's party. And this kind of sense of this boot, kicking out Chinese workers and forcing them back to China. Part of the issue was that because of the Opium Wars, there had been this association between the use of opium and Asian men in particular. But as with so many other drugs, the fear of the drug then gets mixed up with fears about race and sex. And you can see from these illustrations here, this is later. This is not happening during the period leading up to the Chinese Exclusion Act. But there's always this fear that some outside racial group is going to come and take your women, and they're going to give them opium or ensnare them in a life of crime. And eventually, those kinds of fears, going back earlier now, the Chinese Exclusion Act happens in 1882, banning the further immigration of Chinese people and other East Asian people into the United States. And then the Opium Exclusion Act happens in 1909. As one commentator put it, and I hope this quote is going to show up around the picture here, on February 9, 1919, Congress passed the Opium Exclusion Act, barring the importation of opium for smoking as of April 1st. thus beginning a 100-year crusade that has unleashed unprecedented crime, violence, and corruption around the world, a war with no victory in sight. Now, this person, if you believe this person, or if you agree with that point of view, is saying that the violence and the corruption and the crime come not from from opium and opioids themselves, but from the banning of them, from this early evidence of a war against drugs. The first really big legislation happens in 1914. The Harrison Act happens. The Harrison Act is an attempt to control opium and coca, but it's very ambiguous. Partly it comes about because there's this mounting fear of what these drugs are doing to the public. It doesn't ban the substances, but it applies a very heavy tax. Now, we might see, oh, well, it's $1, but that was a lot of money in 1914. So one consequence, it was going to make these substances only available for the very well off. But it also meant that no one else could sell or distribute these items other than doctors. Only doctors could pay the taxes. Again, it was quite ambiguous because then under what circumstances were doctors allowed to distribute them? One of the questions was because doctors were supposed to make a good faith effort to use it only for medical purposes. What about maintenance then? Were doctors allowed to give it to people to maintain their drug addictions? Again, this is particularly with the opioids, to allow them to ward off the painful effects of withdrawal, or was that seen as an illegitimate reason for prescribing opioids? Well, the courts were never very clear about it. One thing that did happen was that 30,000 doctors were arrested after 1914 because they partly depended on local law enforcement who got to decide whether or not maintenance was a legitimate purpose. You have to think about the doctor seeing somebody showing up in their office with very, very painful symptoms of withdrawal. Do they turn that person away, or do they give that person small amounts of opium or opioids in order to ward off their withdrawal effects? This is something, of course, that is still debated and talked about today. Should we use methadone? Should we actually do heroin maintenance? Europe has started to do more and more, parts of Europe have started to do more and more heroin maintenance. So one of the big questions is, did the Harrison Act actually make things worse? Well, here's one thing that happened. Before the Harrison Act, opium addicts, morphine addicts, were largely people who were either using morphine in their fancy parlors at home, or they were getting it from or using it in medical offices, right? Again, these are largely wealthy white women in the case of the medical offices. In the case of the parlors, wealthy businessmen and also white women. So after the Harrison Act, when this avenue is closed off, right, you can't get it as easily from medical offices. What starts to happen is morphine addiction and other forms of opioid addiction passes from kind of these upper-class households into places that we associate with the urban poverty. In fact, the urban junk heaps become highly associated with opioid use because poor people who were addicted to opium or any of the other opioids were going to the junkyards, finding what they could, or finding items to take to the junkyards, seeing what they could sell. in order to get their next dose of opioid. And that's where the term junkies come from. A heroin junkie has the roots in these kinds of desperate addicts going to the junk heaps to try to find items that would help them get their next dose. Okay, another big turning point happens in 1837 with the Marijuana Tax Act. Again, notice that this is, once again, it's not technically banning marijuana. What it's doing instead is taxing it so that it becomes almost impossible to afford marijuana. This comes out first of ferment in New Orleans because there's a lot of fear, a lot of association with music, with New Orleans jazz, and this kind of the sense that the musicians were using marijuana in large numbers. It's not insignificant that the musicians were largely seen as Black men, and the part of the public that was pushing for the exclusion of marijuana were often white members of the white public that were trying to protect or stop white women from associating with Black musicians in New Orleans. Words start phrases start coming out like vicious weed. People start talking about marijuana addicts. And here's one quote from local authorities. Marijuana makes Mexicans bloodthirsty and dangerous. So, of course, most of us today would even laugh at the idea that marijuana makes people bloodthirsty and dangerous because marijuana is a depressant. It usually makes people quieter and mellower. It doesn't make them bloodthirsty. But then you can see the obvious racism in this phrase also. This association in New Orleans with Black men, in other parts of the American South with Mexican laborers particularly. And by 1930, most states had already banned marijuana. The federal government doesn't do this until 1937, and again, it's only a tax act at that point. Okay, this is a name that you're going to get to know very well, Harry Anslinger. The U.S. had no Bureau of Narcotics, nothing like the Drug Enforcement Agency until 1930, and Harry Anslinger becomes the first head of this agency. And here's a direct quote from him. This is not uncommon for Harry Anslinger. This is how he tried to reach the public with messages like this. There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana usage. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. That's a pretty stunning quote. And you can see the very clear and obvious agenda in that. And again, it's a fear of all sorts of things. It's music, it's sexual licentiousness, it's the drug. And so he goes on this crusade. He starts making these movies. His most famous is Marijuana Assassin of Youth. That is, there's a shot of that on the left. Marijuana deals is wild, mad thrills, but it comes at a price, right? Other films of his, The Fall of John Scott and Cassie. I wish I used to have these on old VHSs, and I just don't have them anymore. But I wish I could really show you these. They're quite amazing. Cassie, in particular, is this. She's this young white woman who gets married at a very young age. They move into a house with a picket fence, and she makes the cardinal sin of going to work. And at work, she meets another white woman who introduces her to a marijuana cigarette. And from the start, with just one marijuana cigarette, she loses all judgment. She goes with this other woman to a party. And in this party, someone gives her heroin, and she falls into this life of crime and prostitution. Eventually, she ends up in a mental institution, and she's well. First, I've got to back up a sec. She gets kidnapped by a drug gang and taken off. She gets sold into prostitution by the people in this vehicle, and then she ends up in a mental institution. Then she gets thrown back onto her innocent husband's house, and the last shot is him looking out of the blinds as his wife writhes in psychotic pain on their yard. This is what he was trying to tell people that one puff of marijuana would lead to. And here's a phrase from him: "I wish I could show you what a small marijuana cigarette can do to our degenerate Spanish-speaking residents, most of whom are low mentally because of social," and I can't quite see the quote behind that, but you get the idea. Now, an important part of Harry Anslinger's story is that when he started the Bureau of Narcotics, what he did not intend to do was spend a lot of time on marijuana enforcement. He didn't really see marijuana as the major harm. He saw opioids as the major problem. But then he began to realize he wouldn't get more money for his agency unless he went after a drug that was used by far more people. So that's when he turned the course and started really pursuing marijuana prohibition. And all of these films were designed to show at Parent-Teacher Association meetings. He often went to some of these meetings, and he told the parents, almost always mothers in attendance, that if they didn't do something, if they didn't support a crackdown, that these drugs were going to ultimately take and, quote unquote, assassinate their own children. So once Harry Anslinger is out of the picture, we fast forward a little bit into the late 1960s, early 1970s. President Nixon calls drugs public enemy number one. In 1968, we get this big Anti-Drug Abuse Act. In 1970, another big act, the Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. Now, we've got to think about also what else is going on. It's not that opioid use, and other drug use is not a social problem, but Nixon also is ensnared in an increasingly intractable and unpopular war in Vietnam. And at least some have alleged that this decision to declare war on drugs was in part a way to distract attention from his other growing political problems. And in 1973, the Rockefeller drug laws, these are the harshest, these are in New York State, the harshest in the country. They oppose mandatory minimum sentences of 15 years to life for selling as little as $50 in opioids. Those drug laws become a template for other states. The other states don't go quite as harsh as New York State does. But then maybe the most consequential turning point in the drug war is Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, becomes president in 1981. He declares an all-out war on drugs. Also, very importantly, he shifts the responsibility for federal drug policy from the Department of Health and Human Services to the Department of Justice. So this is no longer going to be seen as a public health issue, but it's going to be seen as a criminal issue. And African Americans become the heavy target of the drug war. The prison population begins to explode, and white drug addicts are still kind of given the health approach, and Black and Latino drug addicts and sellers are increasingly given the criminal approach. So this kind of takes us to the end of this short history of social construction and drug enforcement. We'll pick this up again later. Thanks, everyone.